Welcome back, and I wanted to go over a couple of things from the previous module. First of all, this is a look at make menu select. Let me just get that. Just over here. All right, I'm not going to resize that because I want it to break. Here is the top level where, again, you can check Asterisk add-ons, and you can move over and you can highlight and then hit enter to select these different options. So you can add format MP3, for example. Here's the MySQL stuff I was talking about. And then you can drill down to these other options. Applications, of course, this is all of the dial plan applications. I think pretty much everything is checked by default. I'm going to go back up here to Jack was a good example. The X's indicate that it can't be compiled, and then you can see depends on there down in the bottom left corner. So if I download Jack and resample those packages, however I want to do that, and that's on the system, and then I run configure and make, it'll be available and I could select that. So what I do on pretty much any box is identify applications I use or will use in the initial configuration, applications that might be potentially used, as well as all the channel drivers and stuff, and then deselect everything I'm not going to use. So again, H323 isn't there, but I would deselect EEX. The PBX, making sure that AEL is not getting compiled if you're not going to be using any AEL stuff, which a lot of people don't. That's the Asterisk extension language. It's kind of a different way of configuring extensions.conf. Some people love it. Some people don't even know what it is, but it's pretty common or typically recommended to go ahead and just not compile that stuff if you're not familiar with AEL. You can see all the different resources here. Like I said, just all this stuff is pretty much enabled, and you can go in and deselect it. The phone prov capability is for auto phone provisioning. That's part of the Asterisk GUI. If that's not something you're using, then that's not a module you're going to need. So, like I said, this is a way to pare down the installation, and it's a pretty intuitive little interface. So that's make menu select. Here, down at the very bottom. Oh, notice that on the section there on the left, there's not like a scroll bar indicating that there's more stuff below. So take a look at that. You see, if I keep scrolling down, it'll expose these options. And here's the extra sounds. And I can go through here and select, to download each of the formats if I wanted to. Now that brings me to a point I wanted to clarify to you guys. In review of the installation process for Asterisk, for Asterisk proper at least, you first run configure and then make or make menu select, make install, optionally make samples, make config. What I didn't show you is that on this box I already installed Dotty and libpri. So just a reminder, as I said, if you're going to follow the suggestions we laid out, do install libpri and Dotty first. And again, the purpose of that is so that you have a timing source. One thing I also wanted to show you guys was that you may be familiar with this from previous versions of Dotty, that, these are all the actual drivers for different cards, like WCTDM24XXP. This is the analog driver, so this actually was the same driver for all three of the different densities of our analog card that we offer. And WCTE12XP, that's for the single span T1 card. There's stuff for Zorcom stuff here. And there's this module just called Dotty. And there is no longer a module called Dotty Dummy. It used to be the case that if you wanted to use Dotty for timing and you didn't have a piece of Dotty hardware, you could load the Dotty dummy module. That's no longer necessary. That capability is just built into Dotty proper. So if you just have Dotty loaded, it'll work. So just be aware of that. If you're using Dotty for timing, you need to have it actually loaded. So again, if that's the case, if you're relying on Dotty for timing to ensure that it's loaded and it just kind of happens automatically on boot, remember to, in the Dotty source, we'll just actually go there now. Remember, this is the Linux complete package. This is the combination of both the Linux package, which isn't very well named in my opinion. That is the driver package, and then Dotty tools, like Dotty monitor. Those are all like, yeah, see, Dotty monitor, Dotty test, Dotty maint is a really good one, and Dotty genconf. Dotty genconf, I want you guys to be aware of, because we're probably not going to talk too much about Dotty stuff here, but Dotty genconf will auto-create your configuration for you based on what's detected in the machine. So if the machine detects, the hardware properly, why is that not displaying? So you go down here. This is detected properly as a Digium Inc. wildcard TDM410. And it will write the configuration for you, in again, as a review here, that begins with etc.system.conf to actually configure the hardware proper. Let me move this over so I can see. Third time's a charm. This configuration here, we actually use Dotty genconf, and you can see that it's commented, auto-generated by Dotty genconf on such a date, and it's going to indicate what hardware it detected and how it's configuring it. So the comments are pretty self-explanatory here. And one thing I want to show you, though, that is not intuitive, is that if we go to the Asterisk directory, remember that's etc asterisk, look at the files, there's a whole bunch of them, but if I look at chan Dotty, that's the main file I told you guys that we configure the Dotty stuff for Asterisk. In this case, we have a pound include. This just means include the information from another config file, just concatenate them together. And this file here, Dotty-channels, is the file that's configured by Dotty genconf. So it's a little bit different. It doesn't actually directly edit chan Dotty conf. Okay, so remember that if you're going to be using Dotty genconf in practice or on the DCAP or something, that's often overlooked, and it's not something that's in your face. So real quick, I'll look at Dotty-channels, and similarly, it's commented and has the configuration thrown in here based on what was detected. So all I've got is a 2-port analog card. I mentioned earlier to some folks that the equipment that we make at Digium is a baseboard where the module provides the functionality for the port, whether it's FXS or FXO. So in this case, it's a 2-port card. You can look in dmessage and see that it's port 1 is an FXS and port 4 is an FXO. So I got my phone here connected to the FXS port. Now, don't want to jump around too much, but I wanted to mention as well, after the installation, or during the installation rather, and when you run make, the script is going to try to download the sound prompts from asterisk.org, and this could be different than what you might have experienced installing Asterisk from like a package like Trixbox. If you don't have internet access, it'll try, and I believe it'll time out, I think like 30 seconds and fail. Maybe it's a little bit longer than that. That's not as much of a problem as if you do take the step that I didn't show you guys and go and compile Dotty. See if we can get it to show up here. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm in Etsy. we're going to see it try and download firmware, and I think it already has it, so it's not going to, I'd have to delete it. But it would fail at this point, downloading the firmware for the T1 cards and for the transcoder card from asterisk.org. So this is something I wanted you guys to be aware of if you're going to be doing installations in the field. One of my previous students, we were just talking about that with the training team. It's kind of a common problem that there's not a very straightforward solution for. You just have to, like we do with our travel servers, we'll locally mirror and then just like change the host file so that the machine thinks our server is asterisk.org and get it from that server instead. Because of the different chips that we're using on the T1 card and the echo cancellation cards that we have to secure that firmware, and we can't actually have it for licensing reasons as part of the base tarball. So that's why it has to download it and can be a little bit of a pain. So be aware of that. If you're going to be in the field and not have internet access, then download the firmware beforehand and then just move it to the right directory. I think it should show it here. Yeah. Yeah, under drivers.e firmware. Okay, so pro tip. Any questions before we go forward about installation stuff? Oh, hey, sorry. Okay. No, there's not really a version relationship between the two that you need to worry about where, you have to get an older version of Dottie to work with that particular version of Asterisk. Yeah. There might be some caveats to that, but I can't think of any. Really, the issue is making sure that you've got a compatible driver for your card, and the most recent packages of Dottie will still include drivers for really old, ancient cards like the T100 card that, it's like 7 years old, so should be good to go. One thing you should be aware of, though, is although you're not going to be changing your version of Asterisk for reasons as you mentioned, you'll need to recompile against that version of Dottie to rebuild the Chan Dottie module, and so there could be issues there depending on how old it is, so let's do that. Okay. Any other questions? Sorry. All right, so like I said, I didn't show that, but again, be aware of the fact that you do need to install libpuri and Dottie first, and the caveat there where it'll try and download stuff from the internet and you might not have access. Okay, yeah, a little bit of review again of the ways we can start Asterisk. I was starting Asterisk either by just running the binary because it's in my path as root, but it's actually in user sbin Asterisk. And when I ran service Asterisk start, I was wrapping all funny here, but what actually happens is it runs Asterisk and it runs safe Asterisk. You can see, sorry, it's wrapping, but it's running safe Asterisk, and it's running Asterisk here with a couple of different options, and that's why when I run Asterisk natively, it might be just black and white, but when I run it as a service, I've got different colors for different messages on the CLI. Now, some of there are a number of different flags you can use when you run Asterisk by itself. So if I just run Asterisk -v, for example, will show the version. Just one you want to remember is just H. H will show you all of the different arguments that you can use with Asterisk. A lot of these, are not very commonly used, but the ones you're going to see very, very frequently, and what you're going to see me using, Asterisk-R. That's how you connect to a running Asterisk daemon. So to get to the CLI when Asterisk is started, Asterisk-R. That's all you have to run. And let's see. So I'm going to reconnect. And what you'll notice is it's going to dump this copyright info and all that. And the verbosity level right now is 0. So I can set verbosity higher, core set verbose 10. See, so it change. I'm going to reconnect, and it says the verbosity is 10. I didn't alter the verbosity as I connected to Asterisk. You can do that, however. I'm going to set it back to 0. So the verbose level just affects how much output you're going to get from the CLI, how much information is going to print on the screen. You can set verbose as high as you want. You can get dramatic with it, but this isn't an actually applicable verbose level. Really, you're going to go from 1 to 10. That's the range. There actually going to be any difference. 1 to 3 to 10 is really the different verbose levels. So set that back to 0 again. Exit. And I can connect to the CLI, and this one instance, this one attachment to the CLI that I'm using, I can set verbosity by using the V, lowercase v. So each V is for one verbosity level. So I'll set it to 3 and then add the R. And you can see I connected, verbosity was 0 and is now 3. But this should be just applicable to this session. You can edit logger.conf, and in that config file, set the default verbose and debug levels if you want. So when Asterisk is started, that's what the verbosity level will be. You can connect to the CLI and globally change it like I was doing, core set verbose to whatever you want. But just be aware of the fact that verbosity can impact your logs as well, depending on what logging you have enabled, and if it's logging the verbose log level in particular. And so depending on the size of your file system, that could be a problem. So don't typically leave it very high. What you might want to do is if you're debugging a problem, just temporarily enable it at whatever level you need, and then let it go. I'm going to try and see if I'm going to enable debug to a high level here. Anyone know what the debug option is? What this is for? Yeah. No, I mean, do you know what it's for? Debug in this case is talking about like code level debug. This is mostly useful for Asterisk developers. And as the administrator, it's not often useful. In fact, it can just be overwhelming. I will add, though, if you're having problems with faxing and DTMF, some of the information that appears when debug is enabled can be useful for troubleshooting those things, and that's pretty much it. But I'm going to enable debug and see if I can. I'll set verbose up as well. And just try and make the same call. Should fail like it did before. I haven't changed the dial plan. No debug output came up. Well, the debug messages are in green, and there are several messages that will usually show up. It's actually more verbose than verbose. So that's another thing. If you're not looking for something specific, or you are a developer attacking a particular problem, don't set debug on, because it's just going to flood the CLI with superfluous stuff that you really don't want. So. Now, two other options or arguments I want to show you. You saw me using this earlier. Connect to Asterisk and then use X for execute, and you can send a command to the Asterisk console without actually connecting to it. So if I want to see my SIP peers, instead of a two-step process where I connect to Asterisk and do SIP show peers, I can instead run *-rx, and then I wrap the CLI command in quotes. It can be single or double quotes, and you can have space after the X or not. And I'll just dump to the bash prompt, and that way I can get that information without having to connect. And that's beneficial also if you're on a production machine, with hundreds of users and a lot of active or concurrent calls. This machine, has nothing but a couple of phones registered to it. But on a live box, as soon as I connect to the CLI, all of the dial plan call flow it's going to be scrolling, and it's going to be difficult for me to see exactly what I'm looking for. So in a lot of cases, it's a lot easier to just run the command from your bash prompt. Lastly, actually I'm going to use that command now. Okay, yeah, no, asterisk isn't running. If you run asterisk with the -C option, that's console, and when you connect, it actually it runs asterisk in the foreground, so you see it starting, you see it loading all of its modules, parsing the relevant config files, throwing any notices or warnings relative to that, and then dumping it on the CLI. In this case, you can't exit. You'd have to stop asterisk. This is pretty useful in the case that, as I mentioned, like if you're running asterisk and it's in a loop where safe asterisk is continually trying to restart it, there's a problem when asterisk is starting and there's a bug related to a particular module that it's loading perhaps. And what you can do is just run *-c with some V's for verbosity and watch it load. And as soon as it returns you to a bash prompt and it breaks, you can see that, okay, if that happened right here at app queue, then the problem is likely related to the queue module. And if, in particular, that module happens to be something you don't use, you didn't actually pare down the installation to begin with, or you weren't aware of that even being a possibility, what you can do is edit the config file, as you might be able to guess, modules.conf. All right, and the syntax here is pretty straightforward. You can basically preload, autoload, or no-load asterisk modules, those shared objects. So if there was, in fact, a problem with app queue and I don't use queuing in my installation, I would just say no-load app queue.so and then restart asterisk, and it's not going to try and load that module, and hopefully it'll actually continue and successfully start. Maybe it'll actually fail again at a different module. Now again, that's not something you should expect or anticipate. I mean, obviously, asterisk should be reliable if it's a release version. If you see a problem like that, it might be because if you have an existing installation and you have all the old modules in user-lib asterisk modules, and then you do a reinstall, there might be old modules left behind that asterisk tries to use that's incompatible, like a 1.4 version of chan-ex, and it's a 1.6 version of asterisk. And when it tries to parse that, it'll fail to load. So. Oops. Okay. I already showed these commands to you, but I want to kind of remind you as far as the inline help goes with asterisk. On the CLI, you've got a lot of resources available to you. And you might have seen or noticed what I was doing. You can tab complete at the CLI as well. So if you don't remember the syntax for a command, like how do I see a particular SIP peer? You can hit SIP, tab complete. These are the different. Oops. Okay, now I'm on the CLI. SIP, tab. See the different options below. So SIP show, tab complete. There are the options. Peer, there you go. Okay, so then peer name. Okay, there you go. Now I can see all the different options applied to this SIP phone. Instead of actually going to sip.conf, whatever options are actually being used right now by this endpoint, I can see here. This is pretty useful. I think pretty much the only thing you can't see here is the secret. It'll say that it's set or not set, but it won't show what the password actually is. So that's a good thing. Anyways, tab complete is your friend, especially. There's another option. So if I want to show, if I forget a particular name of an application or codec or a module in asterisk, you can use the option like, so core show application like? We're going to look at these applications in a little bit, but I mentioned right before the break that voicemail capability in general is provided by a number of different applications. And if I wanted to see the different applications that do voicemail stuff, I could run core show application like voicemail. And, oh, maybe I shouldn't have used the whole string. Okay, I'm using the wrong syntax. Try play, like there's play tones, play, okay. You remember the syntax for real? The function has to be capitalized for sure. Oh, okay. You can tab complete, but I'm trying to show just, maybe it's just for the modules, definitely, okay, hold on. You can probably read that better now, a little higher contrast, right? Okay, so is it just for modules? Okay, so module like codec, and this will probably just list okay. Turns out I just don't know what I'm talking about. Find out what the syntax is for that so I can show. Or if anyone else knows. But as far as case sensitivity goes, it's definitely the case that the functions are case sensitive. So if you wanted to show core show function, caller ID, you'd have to either type it all out or, like I was saying, tab complete kind of helps there. Instead of holding down shift or whatever, you can function, tab complete. Autofill there, see. Okay. All right, now we can hopefully get to the, wait a second. There's no module. No lab, rather. Endpoint configuration, we're going to actually set up the SIP phones I have here. They have accounts set up on the phone proper, so I don't have to mess with that. We'll just look at how we can add that to Asterisk. But first, what we'll look at is a basic call flow through Asterisk, kind of the general way that a call end-to-end is established in Asterisk. In particular, what might not be obvious to people at first is that a call in Asterisk is actually comprised of one or more channels, often two channels. Because Asterisk is a PBX and a back-to-back user agent, it's sort of a man in the middle, and you're going to initiate a call from the endpoint to Asterisk, and then Asterisk initiates a call to the other endpoint. So in the end, one call will be two discrete channels. And in fact, you can see that when you run the command core show channels, you see what it shows you here. Separate counts for active channels and active calls. We'll go back and look at this when we make a call from endpoint 1 to 2. I think I call them phone 1 and phone 2 here. And while the call is up, we'll see the dial plan application being used. You can see that here on the right. And it'll show at what point it is in the dial plan. And the count will show two channels, one call. If I were to call to a voicemail application where it's just a call from the phone to Asterisk, and it's just using the application directly in the core, then that's going to be one channel, one call. Okay, and in this example, again, in the phones we're using here, they happen to be SIP, but this will be the same flow as far as the way the call goes through the channel driver configuration and the dial plan, regardless of whether it's DOTI, SIP, EEX, or the first channel is DOTI and the second channel is EEX. And we'll also see how Asterisk handles codec negotiation and codec translation. Okay, so we're going to initiate a call from the endpoint. We're going to dial a number, 202 in this case. Okay, and that's actually started by a SIP invite message. Again, the protocol level stuff here is not important, but we're going to establish what codec we're going to use and a port to use. And assuming that works, then you've got the SIP call control up here going both ways and the RTP media. There are a number of different protocols that SIP uses to establish a call, SDP being one of them, RTP being the protocol that it leverages to actually stream the media. So this is a complete call to Asterisk. And again, if I'm hitting an application like voicemail or playback, like when I played TT Monkeys earlier, this is a legit call. But one of the options applied to that account, and we're going to look at all the options in sip.conf in a second, tells it where to look in the dial plan, a point to start in extensions.conf. And what that's saying is, tell me what to do with the number 202, what dial plan logic to execute. And in this case, these are really basic one-line extensions, that invoke the dial application. And this syntax I mentioned briefly earlier when I was showing you the inline help. This syntax is the first argument that's technology and resource. So that's protocol and endpoint. Okay, so that's the SIP protocol, and this is an endpoint named Bob. So remember the configuration syntax earlier in sip.conf. There's a general section, and then subsections below that for any established account, whether that be for a phone or for a trunk. It is a label in those square brackets. So Bob would have to be a discrete section in sip.conf. The option after that is a timeout, so it's going to ring for 20 seconds before giving up. But we'll look at the dial plan later, so this is just so you know what's going on here. It finds a match for the dial number 202, and that's an extension in the dial plan, a one-line extension that just dials another phone. Okay, so what we do is we go back to, and actually we're looking at sip.conf configuration for that peer or endpoint named Bob or Betty, and apply the options, or look at the options applicable to that account and send the call. So again, this is going to be using the SIP protocol. Doesn't have to be, this could be EEX. And assuming everything works, like we can reach the endpoint, there's not a NAT traversal issue, we have a codec that we can agree upon and it's negotiated, then we establish a call end to end. And hopefully this isn't too confusing, but this is what it would look like in Asterisk. So here's on the far side, this was the initial call coming in here. You see the SIP call control signaling here, and RTP media going to the endpoint, going into the Asterisk core and executing whatever dial plan logic it found based on the number that was dialed. Okay. So right now the call is bridged to the dial application. There are a number of applications available that actually bridge calls in a very similar way. One of those being the queue application. There's actually an application called Bridge, but in this case we're using dial. And I clicked through it kind of fast, but you might have noticed that it was noting like a port and a codec that was being negotiated for the first call and for the second call. But those codecs were different. And there would be no way from the initial call here, when Asterisk negotiated via SIP and SDP what the codec was, what the codec would be for the far side. I can't see in the future, and it doesn't even know what the other endpoint would be, because that was based on purely just the dial plan logic in extensions.conf. So this is a very common scenario where Asterisk, as the media gateway, is going to have to transcode for you. Now, by the way, there are ways, in case you're curious, where you can re-invite or media invite the audio from end to end, which can be desirable for a number of reasons, in particular for latency issues, so that the RTP stream is not going through Asterisk. Typically, you might want it to go through Asterisk, though, because you can do things like this, like transcoding, listen to the audio to enable features, like on a bridge call to enable, hit *2 to record the call. I have to have the media stream going through Asterisk to do that, okay? So there's pros and cons there, but just be aware of the option to do it either way that you prefer. Now, in this case, as I said, each side of the call, each of these two discrete channels, is using a different codec. We've got MULA over here and GSM. So what Asterisk does, in pretty much every case for transcoding except for going from ULAW to ALAW, it'll do that natively. It'll go to sign linear, just raw audio, and then back to the other codec. So to like a middle ground, and then transcode there. So there's not a bunch of direct transcoding paths from codec A to B and all that. It's also this signed linear channel here that Asterisk will hook into to record if you have recording enabled, like using the monitor application or enabling recording through your queue. And I want to show you guys. There's an option or a command, core show translation. And this is a table. We've got the row here of all the codecs that Asterisk can use in this particular version. And again, this is based on what's loaded at the time. So this is going to be not only the modules that you built, the codec modules, but the ones that are loaded. And then you've got a row of codecs on the left. Whoops, sorry. That's not helpful. I'm just highlighting everything. And so, for example, ALAW to, I don't know, ULAW. Well, no, that shouldn't be that slow. This, by the way, this value here is, I think in 1.4, this was milliseconds. It's now microseconds, so it's order of magnitude different, and that's why it looks like these values are so large. What this time is, the time it takes in microseconds to translate like one audio sample, like one 20 millisecond audio packet. And this can give you an idea of the cost to transcode. In particular, see G729, this row right here is just dashes. G729 capability isn't in Asterisk by default. Can anyone tell me why? License encumbered, you know. I know it's a big pain, but you got to pay for G729, and I think that's still the case up until like 2014 at least. There's several patents and licenses associated with that codec. So there is that software license and module that you can download from Digium. And because you can't compile against the version of Asterisk, there's actually under telephony, codec G729, you can pick the version of Asterisk, and then your 32-bit or 64-bit architecture. And then below that, you can choose a precompiled binary for your particular processor. There's several here for 32-bit. And there's a generic one. There's just a regular i686. And what you can do also, if you prefer, there is I think I passed it. There's a benchmark little script it'll run. Bench G729. You got to choose again for the right architecture. And it'll test each of the different codec binary types to find out which one transcoded quickest on your machine. And so just download that particular version of G729. Having done that and run the registration utility to activate the license, it would show up in that column and show what you would see compared to the other translation times on the screen. G729 would be one that would take a good bit longer, just a little bit more resource intensive. That's why we have a transcoder card, one of the few things that we'll offer where you can, instead of just doing it in the CPU, offload that transcoding to that card, and it'll do, I think, 120 channels for both G729 and G723. So. Again, this example happened to be using the dial application, but in any case that there is an Asterisk app that is bridging the call, like app Q, that's pretty much going to, the call will remain there until either there's significant latency that the call is destroyed, that the endpoint is no longer reachable, or someone hangs up, transfers the call, otherwise ends the call. And let me look at the zip show peers should show that we've got 2 phones registered. We're going to look at how to do that in just a second. But I can reproduce what we saw on the screen there. Okay. Okay, this call is bridged, and you saw the dial plan flow where it executed the dial application, technology, SIP. The endpoint in this case, the account name is phone 1. And now if I do core show channels like I did before, I can see where it's at in the dial plan. We're going to talk about the syntax of extensions.conf in just a second, but the full address of extension is always includes the context it's in. But we'll talk about what a context is in a second. But here we go, the channel count, 2 active channels, 1 active call, okay? Okay. Alrighty, so the configuration we're going to show here for the sake of a demo is going to be very simplified. We're going to add or review the account information for the endpoints, the phones, in sip.conf. And then we have to load that information. So you can restart Asterisk, but simply connect to the CLI and run sip reload. It'll reparse its config, apply what it finds in sip.conf. And then the second piece of the puzzle is configuring the dial plan. So we have to make sure that there are extensions in the dial plan to ring these phones. So really, at the bare minimum, we can add about 4 options for our accounts and 1 line extension in the dial plan, and that'll allow you to call endpoint to endpoint. So the bare minimum is actually very slight. I'm going to go through what that looks like here. Okay, again, in a sip.conf config file will typically have a general section above that has globally applicable options, but the account itself will be defined in its own discrete section. And that'll be the account name in square brackets. This account name is really just a label. You can call this what you will. There are some recommendations we typically make, and again, one of the first is do not name your phone the same thing as the extension number you want to use to dial that phone. So in this case, I used 6001. You might have saw that in extensions.conf. I shouldn't name my account 6001. That makes it very easy to have fraudulent registrations to my server, because it's so easy to guess. Common account names are going to be a number, usually 3 digits or 4 digits. And one thing I want to point out, though, there's no limitation on extension number lengths or extension name lengths in Asterisk. So, an old school PBX, it might have to be just one of 2 things, 3 digits or 4 digits long, maybe 5 digits. It can be, any number of digits long in Asterisk. And then these 4 options, these are the 4 I just mentioned that are the bare minimum you need to configure an endpoint. The first is type equals friend. The type declaration, we're not going to touch on too much right now because the valid options for that are kind of ambiguous, and it's something that bothers a lot of people in the community. The names like friend, peer, user are rather ambiguous and easy to confuse those different types. But put simply, the type friend is what's typically used for internal endpoints. And the friend account type means that this config, this section in sip.conf will have options that are that can apply to both incoming stuff like codec negotiation or what IP range we'll accept calls from, as well as outgoing stuff. And context is a good example of outgoing. And it's a good idea to, actually we'll just leave it here. It's a good idea to keep in mind that what we mean by outgoing or incoming, I'm typically referring to that from Asterisk perspective. So actually this would be incoming. The incoming option context means for this account, when a call comes in, where does it go in the dial plan? So when we saw that call flow example earlier where it just went into the little chunk of dial plan, there's extension 202, 203, et cetera. That happened because for that account, it was set to go to that particular context in the dial plan. In this case, we'll call it phones. And then the last thing here, this goes in tandem with the account name. Okay, this is the full account credentials for this SIP account, and that's the name and the password. The password is called a secret, okay? So if you name your endpoint after the extension to dial it, like naming the phone 6001, that's a really bad idea, but at least name or make your secret a very long, actually random string. It can be like 32 characters long, randomly generated, and that will be a lot better than having it, 1, 2, 3, 4, or heaven forbid, call this 6000 and the secret 6000 as well. That'll get owned pretty quickly. So we definitely recommend against that. And keep in mind, this account is not a user account, right? Even if it's an endpoint that's going to be used by an internal user or some traveling salesman, they're never going to need to put that password in, right? That's something that's configured on the phone, and or otherwise an endpoint, a trunk or what have you, and that's it. It's there, and it shouldn't likely change, and your users don't need to have access to that. So there's no reason why, at a bare minimum, the secret should be a very complex random string. There's random string generators online. Just create a script to do that if you're provisioning a large number of phones at the same time. If Cassius is still in here, he created a script to do that. I guess he's gone. So, any questions so far? Yeah.
Is there any reason other than that security
There is actually. That's a good question. Security through obscurity. We don't want to have a name that's easy to guess. All those scripts that are out there that just go through, all the different numbers and examples like A and phone and administrator. There's a reason why you might not want to name your endpoints after numbers because of the way that, depending on whether it's a user or a peer, Asterisk tries to match incoming calls. So it might do something, the call behavior might be rather unexpected if it's a peer and it's going, therefore Asterisk is matching on the name and the from header. If you've got accounts that are numbers, it gets weird behavior, and that's actually described a little bit better in that section at the top of sip.conf called usernames. It explains how each of the types matches a username and best practices for names. So, yeah, just to avoid some headaches. Okay, and again, this is really the bare minimum. You can have disallow equals all to blacklist all codecs, and then allow specifically the codecs you want to add. So we'll actually go look at one of our accounts. Sip.conf. Yeah, whatever. Okay, so see here, I've got phone 1 and phone 2, and they look exactly like we had on the board. And I am disregarding the best practice I mentioned, and I have a really crummy password. Host is dynamic. I didn't mention this earlier. Host, you've got two different options. You can set it to dynamic or static. In the case where it's static, you're actually going to set the IP address of the endpoint. I typically recommend using dynamic even if you have statically configured endpoints, because in my opinion, it's silly if you're going to statically configure endpoints, and then if you ever have to change them, you have to change it twice. Change it on the endpoint or wherever you configure it, and then change it for its relevant configuration in Asterisk. So, still leave it dynamic and, manage your endpoint's IP addresses however you want to do that. Now, be aware that host equals dynamic implies something very specific, that the endpoint is going to register. Anyone want to tell me in their words what registration means? SIP registration? Yeah. Right, and to extend on that, what that means is the endpoint is going to use a registration method that may be different depending on its protocol to tell the server where to reach it, right? Because otherwise, having just the word dynamic here, I don't know what the IP address of this phone is. But what the phone does is, and by default, it's going to register every like 45 seconds, okay? So if I enable SIP debug in Asterisk, it's going to be very verbose. That's one of the cool things about SIP is it's ASCII encoded, so it's human readable text. And I'm not going to initiate a call or anything, so there's not going to be actual call flow messages coming in. But in a couple seconds, we should see the messages that the phones are sending to register to Asterisk, constantly telling it what its IP address is. And that's how, if I do SIP show peers, I see what the host address of these phones is. I wouldn't know that otherwise. Okay. Gonna wait a couple seconds here. Should. Thought it was 45, but. It's wrapping, but I think what should be over to here. Oh, yeah, okay, it's just showing the port. You're right, yeah. It'll in fact, the default port for Asterisk, of course, is 5060 as well, and it'll only show 5060 until it gets a valid registration from a different port. So if you set up a phone to use 5061, it'll show it here as unmonitored, and the host will be unknown. And then when it registers, it'll know the IP and the port, and it'll actually show up correctly. That's a good question because really it's going to be based on the endpoint. The timeout that it's using to send its registration methods won't be configured here. You can set timers here, but that's going to be Asterisk timers. I think it does. Well, all the information that there should be just when you do SIP show peer name. That's a good question. So it should be expiry, I think is what it's called. Oh, okay, there you go. So that's a lot longer than I thought. Okay, so oh yeah, I wanted to show you the different options. Sorry, whoops. That's what dynamic implies. The other thing to be aware of, on the endpoint, its configuration, whether you actually go through the menu and configure the phone directly, or you use the web config, or in the case of Polycom or other like executive phones, use a boot server to give it its config, you can set whether or not it wants to register. So if I'm expecting it to register, I need to ensure that my endpoints have registration enabled, or else no one's going to be talking to each other. So I think registration should be enabled by default. And as far as the configuration applied by the web config for these phones, it certainly is. So I didn't have to do anything extra there. Now, I can add a bunch of different options here. This is what I want to show you. If I set allow or disallow equals all, that disables all codecs, and then I can enable the codecs I want in like a preference order. But I want to allow equals ULAW, that's MULAW, and allow equals GSM. Now, this is one thing that confuses people because this implies that I've got a static list, a preference order, that it should negotiate ULAW first. If the other endpoint doesn't speak ULAW, choose GSM. Asterisk actually right now, and this is going to change in Asterisk 10, it's pretty well documented what their intentions are on the Asterisk wiki, but basically in the code, and I think it's either, I'm not sure actually if this is part of the PBX core or if this is dependent, or it's actually coded in each channel driver, but nonetheless, Asterisk has a basic default sort order where it'll choose or negotiate the codec in the end based on cost of transcode. So the final rule, or what it cares most about, is resource cost. So sometimes, especially when it comes to G729, people will be enabling that as the preferred codec for an endpoint where it's account for a remote endpoint, you know, like Uncle Traveling Matt's Akiga soft phone, and it won't use GSM or G729. It'll keep using ULAW, and it frustrates. And it's because GSM being a higher cost of transcode, it ends up picking GSM instead. And there you go. So if you have a remote endpoint and really you want it to just use G729, then probably better off just doing this, where the only codec allowed is G729. You see the reason that is again, I blacklist all codecs, disallow all, and then allow only G729. One other thing to be aware of, though, if I have, under the general section, enabled anything globally, that'll be inherited by the endpoints configured below. So that's something that's sometimes overlooked as well. But you should be able to see the combined codec capability of the endpoint a couple different ways. First of all, again, if you do sip show peer name, here's the codecs it can use. And if you enable sip debug and watch when the initial invite is set up, that includes the SDP. SDP is the protocol, session description protocol, that SIP leverages to describe services, what the endpoint can do, like the DTMF mode it's going to use, its codec capability, the RTP port range, or the port that it wants to use. And you'll see at that first point in the call flow, it'll say what our capability is, what the endpoint's calling in capability is, and then the combined capability, the range of codecs or codec that we share. And sometimes the call will fail because the shared range, the codec, there is no codec that we can choose, and you'll see I think a 486 message, no compatible codec. So again, even if you've never used it before, the SIP debug, the SIP messages that you see are all human readable and relatively straightforward. Oh, the other one I wanted to show you was, for my endpoints, I like to add, I keep doing that, I need to save it. Qualify equals yes. This can be beneficial if your endpoints are behind a crummy firewall and the continuous outgoing options message that the asterisk will send to that endpoint, because it's using it as a way of checking latency, might keep a hole open in the firewall so that guy can get back through. But if I enable this for the endpoint, and then I do a SIP reload, there's the SIP debug I was talking about. It's going to wrap again, I think, but yeah, okay. You can see the latency in milliseconds here for that endpoint, and again, that's round-trip latency using a SIP options message. So that's more accurately relative to the latency for that call for this particular protocol. So. Now again, the second piece of the puzzle, at least for this configuration, is adding the dial plan and extensions.conf. And before we do that, I want to look at the basic syntax for creating extensions in the dial plan. The top level organizational unit or logical unit in the dial plan is the context. And this is actually one of the most important things to understand well, is how contexts work in the dial plan. And they separate extensions. And it's not just for like multi-tenant setup or logically grouping extensions based on like a feature type. The benefit here provided by context that hopefully you'll be able to see a little bit later on is one for security, as well as class of access. So we can configure our dial plan well. We'll prevent toll fraud or people abusing our system, and we can have different feature capabilities for different users. So if I have just a call center agent, I can configure the dial plan appropriately using context to prevent them from being able to make outgoing calls. And I could have, of course, an executive user be able to make international calls or whatever he wants to do. And that's all done by context. Now, we'll get it first here. This is a one-line extension. This is very atypical. Typical extensions in the dial plan are going to be several lines long. It's a scripting language essentially. But the first line, at least, always has the extend declaration followed by equals, and then you can have the caret here or not, and you can have white space around the operator as well. Asterisk doesn't care as far as that goes. This is one of the things that starts to annoy people as they start to really delve into the dial plan. Asterisk at one point will be very picky about syntax usage, and if you have white space here or there, it'll bark about it when it pre-parses the config or when it actually tries to make a call. And then some places it doesn't care at all. One example I'll show you actually that's really silly and something you want to avoid is if I'm sorry, what am I doing? I'm going to go to the dial plan, extensions.conf, and I'm going to go to the bottom here. I'm going to add a context, call it whatever I want. Again, this is just an arbitrary label. What we should name these contexts should be indicative of the purpose of the context, whether it's for admin, features, or long distance dialing capability. And this can be any length, but you can have special characters in the context name if you want. And a context of no white space, this is actually totally fine to asterisk. But again, name your context well, and don't worry about how long the label is. Oops, I keep doing that. Now the next piece of the extension is the extension name. I want to be clear that's the name, not the number. Typically, of course, it's going to be a number, right? I mean, that's a lot easier for people to dial, especially users who aren't used to having to dial a name. But you guys might be familiar with the ability for phones like the Polycom phone to use the display to, you hit a button and you can enable ASCII mode, and then you hit the number key and it'll go through the letters on the number key like, associated with that digit, as you can see on the button itself. So dialing by name, alpha extensions and asterisks is totally fine, and again, the length doesn't matter. So you can have an extension here called Tom. Just be aware of that. And that's going to be particularly important when we start talking about pattern matches. I know probably a lot of you guys use pattern matches in your dial plan, and those have special characters like X, Z, and N. So the extension anyone know what that means? Any digit 0 through 9, right. So each of these places, exactly, that's where I was going with this. This is a valid extension, because I can dial XXXX from this phone. Okay, and so that's a literal extension. To indicate that it's a pattern match and that character means 0 through 9, underscore. Always got to be an underscore. So thank you for that. So this is one of those really common missed things, especially when you're first starting to configure the dial plan. It's easy to overlook. Don't forget the underscore. You're never going to be able to hit that pattern match otherwise. Here's something else I want to point out as I was talking about best practices and things to avoid. If you have a pattern match, let's make it a real pattern match first. This is kind of just pseudocode here for the sake of example and for brevity. We'll do a dial some phone. Okay, so that's not the right syntax, but you kind of get the point. This is a valid extension, okay? Doesn't really do anything worthwhile, but the first line, the first priority here, we'll talk about priorities in just a second, dials some phone. But the next priority is a playback, uh-oh. And the reason I wanted to show you that is because what might happen is if I have an extension here, 6001, priority 1, in this case it's a dial, but regardless of what the application is, it very well could and will fall through to XXX, priority N, which means next, because this extension matches the dialed number 6001. Asterisk will store the dialed number as the channel variable extend, and if extend matches this pattern match, then you can have this happen where it starts to execute this logic and plays back uh-oh. So I've had a lot of people in consulting and in support call with problems like this in their dial plan. They're losing their mind wondering why they're getting this strange behavior in the dial plan, and that's exactly why. So just be aware of that possibility. And again, one of the main ways to avoid things like this is making, first of all, pattern matches as granular as possible. That's typically how you want to do that, and separating things logically by using contexts. But, okay, let's leave that open. Continuing on in the syntax here, the next very important element, separated again, I didn't mention this earlier, all of the components of an extension are limited by or separated by a comma. And the next piece here, this is the priority number, this is the sequence number. So if it's a one-line extension, it's always going to start with 1 and then go from there. And there's a couple of different ways we can, we can number them. Finally, we invoke an application. And this application can be one of whatever applications are loaded in Asterisk, so that'll depend on the app modules that exist in userlib Asterisk modules, and then if you've manipulated that list of modules by using modules.conf, right? But regardless, if you had the dial application loaded, the syntax here to the right is in parenthesis, the argument structure to the application. Now, this will vary wildly depending on the application. So again, core show application blah is your friend. Whatever goes in between the parentheses is described there. So core show application voicemail. The proper syntax in this case is mailbox number at context, and that's actually hopefully not to confuse you here because this is kind of early on as we talk about the dial plan. There is the concept of a voicemail context as well, which is pretty much the same idea. It's a grouping of voicemail boxes, like where you can separate voicemail boxes by department, for example, voicemail boxes for sales, support, etc. But so if you're not familiar with the application and or you forget how it works, what goes in parenthesis is set there in the CLI inline help. Now, one thing about the syntax in extensions.conf, you can invoke a number of applications without using any arguments at all. like hang up. And it is technically valid to not even have the parenthesis there next to it. It's just sort of, I guess, I don't know, common to do that. So this is how I always configure my dial plan. We're going to talk about pattern matches in a little bit, and we'll talk about why this is normally a bad idea to do underscore dot and why we are using that in the default context. Okay. So again, this is always going to depend on the application. In this case, for dial, you might have noticed that the second argument is the timeout. And again, this is optional. You don't have to set a timeout. Remember, if you left it alone, it'll ring for 136 years. And then you can optionally add a comma here to add a string of options. When you add options to the dial, in this case, like M to play music on hold instead of ringing, if I wanted to add another option like K or W or T, you just string them together. You don't have to delimit them with a comma or a pipe. That'll actually break. So just be aware of that. Just string them all together. And reference the inline help if you're not sure about the case, because case does matter. Lowercase w and uppercase W do very different things with the dial application. So, yes. Just taking some notes or have a question? Okay. Okay, so I mentioned the sequence number here, and you saw me use the N for next. Let's take a look at a couple different ways we can create extensions. A two-line extension, okay. So logically, what we would want, if I dial this phone right now, it's going to ring forever, right? Why is that? No timeout, yeah, okay. So let's go ahead and add that. I'm going to add a short timeout, actually like a 5-second timeout, okay? All right, good to go. Now, what happens when I dial the, sorry, I keep doing that, guys. If I dial the phone and a 5-second timeout is reached without the user answering, we want it to go to voicemail, but what actually happens is it hangs up. Okay, so Asterisk will terminate the call. There's something called auto fall through, and basically old school Asterisk behavior would be really wonky, like in Asterisk 1.0. If you had this one-line extension and you dialed 5 seconds, timeout is met, Asterisk will silently just wait there listening for input for you to dial another extension or something. And again, really crazy behavior could happen depending on what extensions you had in that context. So normally, Asterisk will hang up. One of the things that we always recommend as a best practice is to kind of cap or end any dial plan logic, regardless of whether it's a one-line extension or 40-line extension or macro, with the application hang up. Okay? So that way, this would have resolved that problem I showed you earlier, where it might have fallen through to the end priority for the underscore XXX pattern match. If I ended this application properly, or this extension properly, that would prevent that, okay? So, in this case, though, what we're going to do is add voicemail. We're going to look at the voicemail syntax and options for it in a little bit, but for now, we'll just learn to spell and add voicemail with no arguments. And so there you go. Now this is going to be a little bit more logical, a user experience that would be more typical and expected, right? Now, what I've done here is the second line of the extension I've numbered discretely or directly as 2. Okay, so the sequence number you can give direct names. And if I wanted to add a third line here, a third priority, I could do that just by adding 3, and we'll do, I don't know, we'll add a hang up. Now, if you number your priorities directly like this, you might see a problem if you try and reorder things. Okay, in this case, this is fine, right? Because it parses the configuration and just follows the sequence numbers. Even though this looks silly to me, editing the dial plan, Asterisk would load this correctly. So actually, I'm going to go ahead and save this. dial plan reload to parse the config, and then I'm going to do dial plan show, I forget what context that was, but we can see here, this is extension 6001, and it's loaded in the right order, right? Okay, but if we are going with that route and we're going to number our priorities directly, you got to remember that if I go back and I'm making changes to something some other administrator did, I'm like, why do we have a hang up there? I don't know what that is. Delete that. You see what the problem is here? It's not going to handle that well that there's a missing priority. It's not going to load any priority because there's a missing priority too. And in fact, when I try and parse that config, it should complain about that. So dial plan reload. Let's see if it barked about it. It's going to fail. Well, okay, so it silently just stops parsing. So what you should see is just one priority in that extension. So I'm going to do dial plan show again. And actually, no, it didn't. So it loads it, but it's never going to get there. Let me make a call. Sorry, I'm going to. So it actually is loading it. But if we call, yeah, okay, we have a short timeout. So I'm going to go ahead and call that extension, and it should fall through to voicemail. And you should hear Allison Smith say mailbox, and she'll prompt you for the mailbox number, assuming the default context, that is the default voicemail context. 6001. Oh, wait. Wrong phone. But it shouldn't be complaining about the username in the digest having nothing. That's weird. It was working earlier.
Do you still have 729 on it?
I'm not sure. I'm going to go fix it. Oh, you know what? I'm not sure if that phone has a secret set on. Okay, so we're going to reload SIP here. Well, yeah, but it'll work either way. Okay, I'm going to let it time out. Give it 5 seconds. You see it fell through to nothing. It didn't go to that next priority. The priority is there. It's in the dial plan, but it's the sequence number is wrong. What I first like to show you is what I mentioned earlier. I don't know what I'm doing. Using N instead of directly numbering your priorities. I assume most of you, if you edit the dial plan directly, you probably use N. Yeah. It's in most of the example literature or actually, here what I'm going to do. So if I had, just kind of reversing what I did earlier, if I had this logic, as you might be able to guess, if I load this, it's going to just follow the physical order that the extension lines are listed because N means next. So in this case, it will in fact invoke hangup directly after the dial because that's where I put it. So if you're going to move things around in the dial plan using N, be aware of that. One other thing, when this is parsed, it is given a sequence number. So if you wanted to create a label for your priority and address it directly, it's still valid to directly point to priority 3. Okay, so I'm going to save that and load it again. We'll talk about priority labels in a second. I know this is something some of y'all may not be familiar with, but show. See, it still has numbers, and so if I wanted to use like a conditional branch to point to a priority 3, it's still valid. We usually use priority labels, though. Okay, so that's the N priority, and also something new that you guys might have started using is the same declaration instead of repeating all of this nonsense, especially if this extension was a pattern match for a long distance number and you've got 12 characters instead of the 4 here. What you can use is same. That should be it. Make sure. Yeah. Okay. What that does is notice that the syntax is just to point out the remember the delimiter there that separates the options or each argument actually in an extension is the comma. So what same technically means is extend equals greater than 6001 comma. And then you can just have the priority here, and you can, of course, number it however you want using N, S, or number them directly. And depending on whether or not you've been, coding dial plan for a long time, this might look really weird and, not something you want to do. In a lot of ways, if you're new to the dial plan, this might make a lot more sense because this is all kind of redundant doing it like I was just showing you. And again, if the extension name is really long, then it's extra tedious. Of course, if you have vim foo and you can just copy the lines and move them around, and it's a lot quicker instead of typing it out like I have been. But when you have extensions like this, it's actually a lot easier to visually discriminate between the start of a particular unique or new extension if you're not blocking it out with white space or whatever. So this can actually be a lot easier to parse depending on the person. But for me, it's always still really weird. I'm not used to it after years of doing it a particular way, you know what I mean? What's that? I think 162, yeah. Well, it depends on the version of Business Edition. I don't even. No, well, the thing is I don't know at this point the relationship between Business Edition versions and open source versions. There used to be a 1-for-1 correlation. Now they're pretty diverged, and I don't know what 362 is related to. So, actually, one thing to be aware of too is because. Well, no, it's not. It's not that big of a deal. It's just that if anyone else is using Business Edition, the version I think after B kind of dovetailed so that they aren't 1-for-1 related, and Business Edition can have dramatically different things in it where it's actually like a flavor that's based off 1.6 or 1.4 rather, but it has features backported from 1.6, so it's almost the same thing, But to know that difference would be very important if you're doing any development on it. So, anyways. Okay. So there you go. I think that's enough for that syntax. And if it's important, I can find out for you. What was the version? 3.6.2? Okay. Again, the extension that we looked at originally, that one-line extension, quite silly. In a real environment that works, I was able to make a call, but none of the typical capabilities, feature functionality was available to me. I couldn't leave voicemail. I can't do anything except call one phone. Okay, so this is a very simple dial plan so far, but we're going to go ahead and okay. This is actually kind of redundant. I hope that you guys kind of got the gist of this, and this is probably something you guys are already applying in production. Don't rely on what's in extensions.conf or sip.conf. Look at what's in the dial plan that's loaded into memory at the time by doing dial plan show. And let me show you one reason why you might want to do that, just to kind of give you an idea of how important contexts are. I mentioned that you can use these to separate the dial plan out for a lot of reasons. If I go to extensions.conf, phones is what I called the context that includes my extensions to reach my internal endpoints. Decent enough name. Could do a better job, but it gets a job done here. Let's pretend, for the sake of a relatively decent example, that this is a multi-tenant installation. I'm a provider of a hosted PBX solution, and really what I'm doing is just I've got one big Asterisk box with my dial plan servicing multiple different companies, and I'm separating that out through context. So I could have a different extension. We'll call this, we'll get real pedantic, internal endpoints for, what are we going to call my company? Chantel. You like that? Chantel Pimentel. Yeah. Okay, so point being, in this context, I can validly add an extension that's essentially a duplicate Okay, you see what I'm talking about? Now, this is completely valid. I mean, that endpoint doesn't exist. Don't worry about it. But I've got two extensions, 6001, okay? And that's okay because they're separated by a context. Context, again, being the highest organizational unit. The true name or address of an extension is always extension at context, okay? So let's take a look at that. In the CLI, of course, best practice. I've always been doing dial plan show up until this point. That shows the whole dial plan. But what I want to see is specifically the dial plan logic or the extension logic for my phone. So what I would do is dial plan show extension at context 6001 at phones. And it just shows me just the logic for that one endpoint. Okay, so but just do dial plan show to see the whole thing. We've got 6001 here, and did I do reload? So no, I didn't. Dial plan reload. Hopefully I can tab complete. I don't know if it parsed it right. Yeah, great. Okay, so now it's biting me that I named it a really long context. There you go. So just for the sake of contrast, to kind of solidify what I'm talking about here, if you do add a duplicate extension in the same context, so it becomes duplicate if you have this start or first priority. Okay, remember you can have multiple lines in an extension, but what I'm going to do is add an extension 6001 priority 1, and that is no bueno. So we'll just do playback. Good old TT monkeys, how about that? Because every phone system needs screaming monkeys. Now, at the CLI, do dial plan reload. It should warn about the duplicate extension here. Unable to, register. The extension already exists. So you can see that if we do a dial plan show 6001 at phones, what we find is the first extension. So it's gonna parse and load the extensions as it goes through the file, and the first man wins. So the second extension that I tried to add there, it kind of kicked it out. So remember, the name of an extension is always extend at context, or 6001 at phones. Okay? Any questions about that? All right. That is definitely good stuff to know. Usually confuses people. And we did all this stuff, I think, so. Actually, that's actually something simple that we can. Someone during the first break asked me about the AskDB, something that changed recently in Asterisk. The AskDB used to be a Berkeley database, and actually a pretty old version of Berkeley DB, and was replaced with, I think, a SQLite, right? Yeah. And then if you do an upgrade, there's actually scripts that will automatically convert the existing DB to the new DB, so you don't have to do anything on your own if you're using the AskDB for anything unique. Like I was mentioning, one of the common things that we do in one of our classes is enable features that normally aren't on old analog endpoint. I don't have a do not disturb button here, but using the AskDB and storing a value in there that is persistent on boot because it's actually written in the database, I can use dial plan logic to add that kind of capability to that endpoint. But one of the things, one of like 2 or 3 things Asterisk uses the backend DB for is the SIP registrations. So if you do SIP show registry, it'll show who's registered, or actually this shows who we're registered to, but let's see, should be able to see, well, registration, I'm sorry, I forget. Anyways, I wanted to show you the, you can see the SIP registrations directly from a SIP command, and you can also do database show. Okay, and you've got, this is a key tree where under this SIP registry, it's going to add each of the discrete accounts, and you can see the information here, including the IP address and the port. So one of the ways that I could, from the CLI, unregister a phone, get it out of the DB, would be to use the database commands like database, delete, and I think it was actually do del tree, get rid of all of them. Okay, so if we do SIP show registry again, unless the expiry, yeah, okay. So when the expiry for the SIP registrations is met and the phones try and re-register, they will. You'll see it, if the verbosity is set, you'll see a 1-line or 2-line message come up on the CLI saying, this phone with this account just registered using this particular port. And then if you look at the registry, or excuse me, the AskDB, you'll see the registrations in there. So having destroyed the registrations, if I do SIP show peers, we'll see, oh, actually I think I have to do, I might have to restart Asterisk. It should show, it shouldn't have the host name anymore, unless I registered just now. No? Okay, let's restart and see what happens. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so that was not expected behavior. One of the things that you can do instead of just relying on Asterisk to load the configuration, if I do SIP reload, you've seen me doing this several times, and dial plan reload, you see it simply says reloading SIP, and if you set verbosity up, it should actually show the config files that it's parsing. Let's try and set verbose up to 9 billion. Okay, and then SIP reload. Okay. Now we're going to unload and load the module itself, the actual shared object. Okay, see how it's unregistering all those custom functions and applications? Applications like SIP add header that don't actually have an application module, those get loaded when you load the chan SIP module, and you can see, sorry. The different relevant config files it's parsing. Anyone know what users conf is? Somebody? Nobody uses the Asterisk GUI. The Asterisk GUI, the project I was mentioning, that is just the GUI that comes with like a business edition Asterisk, puts its configuration in users.conf. And what it can configure there is all the different technologies in one place. So it'll configure SIP endpoints, .e channels, et cetera. Now, that's why it's parsing users.conf, because there's SIP stuff that could be there. And you can see it now registering and loading all those applications I mentioned when we unloaded the module. So if I do core show application SIP, remove header, see now it's there. So I wanted to show you that because when I was looking at the registry and it hadn't refreshed itself, reload wasn't enough. If I had actually forcibly unloaded and loaded the module, it would have fixed it without actually restarting Asterisk, which could be important in production. And here's one example where that actually comes up a lot. If you're using a hybrid installation where you've got, let's say, SIP endpoints, some SIP trunks for long-distance calls, and you're using .e for whatever, a PRI or a couple of analog lines, if you've got a bunch of calls, we'll say you're connected to Asterisk, and you do SIP show channels. Of course, you got nothing going on this box. But you might see, you've got some SIP calls active across the trunk, and but no .e channels are actively in use. Well, that's good. If you wanted to change some of the signaling options you've set in chan.e.conf, normally what the documentation will tell you is you have to restart Asterisk. Well, instead, you could do what I did earlier, module unload chan.e, and then module load chan.e. This way, you don't have to restart Asterisk and affect other users who are making calls on the SIP trunk. And so you minimize the impact there. So this is a pro tip I make sure everyone in my class sees. If you ever have to make changes on a live machine, you can mitigate the damage usually doing something like this. So FYI. Now at this point, having restarted everything, I think if we do SIP show, or excuse me, database show, we should see the registry in there. Guess not. What I'll do is tell the phones to register. So that should take care of that. Sorry. Okay. I think now might be a good time to take a break. It's been a couple hours, right? Let me double check. I think we're at the end of this module. And what we're going to do now that you know the basic syntax of how to create an extension, we'll go and we'll finally start actually doing some cool stuff with the dial plan. First, adding functionality like we were just looking at to our internal users, so it makes more sense, like voicemail. Yeah?
What is the difference between programming the dial planning as extension.com and extension.il related to performance?
Oh, okay. Performance on the machine as far as extension AEL versus the regular dial plan. That's a good question, and I think there are some metrics out there on that. But the thing you got to realize is the performance impact is often the initial pre-parts of all the extensions, and that's one thing that people see. Like if they actually still use static config files and they have thousands of users and different extensions for them, loading that file. You can watch the CLI. And normally Asterisks start under a second, but you'll see it hang, and you watch the CLI, and then 45 seconds goes by, and all of a sudden it starts to finally parse the config and show that information going by on the screen. So that initial dump of information is important. And I think there's a test option, and actually I don't remember the name of it. I think it came out in 1.6.2. Hold on one second. I think in the sample dial plan it's towards the top, but you can enable it, and it changes the way that Asterisk parses the dial plan. That should significantly increase performance. And that's something to be aware of in case, if the goal is to improve performance of your dial plan, you may not have to move to AEL. Are you using AEL currently, or just wondering which is the better performance? Okay. Yeah, it's a fair question. I've actually researched this before and talked to some developers about it. I haven't got a conclusive answer. The difference, I've been told, and the difference, of course, it's documented, is just making it an environment that developers are more comfortable with. This is a real simple scripting language, and people who haven't scripted before can learn this. It's very straightforward. But any C developers in here? Okay, you ever use AEL or look at AEL2? It makes a lot more sense to someone who spends their time in that environment. Instead of learning a whole new environment, you can just use AEL. Now, there is a performance difference because it's different, right? But when I dug down to look for that, I didn't see any benchmarks done at the time to show if there was any significant difference. So the answer, as far as I'm aware, is no significant difference. Okay, as far as performance goes. Exactly. It's about the administrator, what they're more comfortable with, right? And that can be something to consider, though, if you have multiple admins working on the same box. They have to be on the same page, I guess, as far as that goes. But the configuration overall, the dial plan itself, remember, can come from multiple places. I think it is actually possible to load dial plan from real time, from a database, and still have static, config files as well. So, sometimes that's actually, as I mentioned earlier, undesirable and something that surprises people. Just again, a simple example, guys, of where dial plan can be loaded, but not from extensions.conf, is call parking. Call parking, for those who aren't familiar with that feature, is like a hold and forward kind of feature. Some people use it, some people never have heard of it. Anyone actually use call parking in their environment? Yeah. Do you like it? Exactly, and that's what it is. It's call parking is where instead of holding and then transferring, you transfer the call to a parking lot, and then they can just dial that parking lot extension to pick it up. And one thing people do a lot is transfer it to themselves. Yeah. Yeah. If the version of Asterisk is new, yeah. And I think, again, 1.6.2 or 1.6-ish, it's in the changes file, added multiple parking groups, so you can do that. Yeah, before in 1.4 it wasn't possible, and that bothered some people for sure, understandably. Yeah. No, 1.4, yeah, it came out when the Asterisk GUI came out, yeah. Absolutely, yeah. That's a good question. I forget offhand. I'm pretty sure, though, I've seen this happen a lot. And the thing is to remember this. The overlap there, if you're stepping on your own toes, usually is avoided because users conf is configured by the GUI. So it's not typically the case that an admin will be doing two things at once, where they're configuring a SIP trunk named, Chantel, and then go into the GUI and create the same thing, and that puts it in users.conf. So it's not that common, but just like we saw where we added the extension 6001 after 6001, the first one took precedence. In any case that you load a channel, like we'll do this. We looked at SIP earlier and then Chandati. Let's look at EEX. If I unload the channel, okay, and then load it again, it's going to parse the config, and you're going to see it should parse eex.conf first and then users.conf. Yeah, see. So, and we can actually lab this up during the break if you want to look at it. What I recall happening is once you load an account like Chantel in EEX, since users.conf is parsed after that, it'll throw a fit about that because it already exists. It's already loaded into memory. So, right. Sorry. I've never used a mic before, so I keep apologizing. I should just take the mic off and start yelling at you guys, but then it wouldn't be recorded. Okay, so I don't think it's on the calendar that I have, but I think now is a really good time for a break, especially since we just finished this module. Why don't you guys take like 15 minutes? I'm going to hang around if you have any questions, and I'm going to lab up an EEX account real quick, and we can see what happens, all right?